I'm not sure how they did it, but they created a brand new grade 3 boss unit for Tachikaze that might be worse than Gaia. And I'm not sure if I should be impressed or very, very disappointed.
Stand up! Vanguard!
Hey Cardfighters, welcome back to another Cardfight update, and today we've got some more new cards for the upcoming Client Selection Plus Volume 1, and this time we've got some brand new Tachikaze cards. But instead of going over from Grade 1 all the way up to the new Grade 3 boss unit, let's start off with this new boss unit because it's kind of disappointing and underwhelming, and there isn't really a lot to analyze and talk about, but that's not the case for the support cards around him that are actually really good, and thankfully very, very generic. So with that said, let's dive straight into this new grade 3 boss unit for Tachikaze, which is Light Battle Dragon Giganoto Blazer. And his abilities are continuous Vanguard circle. During your turn, if 3 or more new equip gauges were put for your units this turn, all of your front row units get power plus 5k. So basically, if you create new gauges, and you need to specifically create gauges, moving doesn't count, your entire front row gets plus 5k power. Now, the interesting part here is that all your units gain plus 5k power in the front row, which also includes your Vanguard, and it includes units that didn't get the gauges. So if your back row units get gauges, you can still power up your front row, which is kind of nice. But the problem here is that this is effectively worse than Gaia, because Gaia just passively gives 5k power to any unit with gauges, which incidentally is probably as much as this card, because if you gave 3 units gauges, that's basically your front row. So that's another 5k. So in the same sense, it gives the same power. But in Gaia's case, you can give the back row power, and if your opponent is grade 3, it doesn't give 5k, it actually gives 10k. So it's even better than Gigannoblazer. So not only is the condition harder to reach, because if you do not create gauges, you do not even get power, and the potential roof on this skill is even lower than of Gaia. But it doesn't stop there, because we also have the second ability, which is Act on Vanguard Circle once a turn, cost Counter plus 1 and Soul plus 1, draw 2 cards and call 2 cards from your hand to the Vanguard Circle, put up to 1 card from the top of your deck face down as a equip gauge for each of those units. So effectively, for a Counter plus a Soul Blast, you put 2 units onto the field, you give them gauges, and you draw those cards back. But luckily you draw first, which means you have more control over what you call. And this can be great as a setup skill, because if you already know which 2 cards you're going to call, it is effectively a draw 2, which also create gauges, which incidentally will build towards his first continuous skill, because now you only need to create 1 more gauge, and you're already done fulfilling the condition. Now, the problem here is that it's kind of underwhelming as a boss unit, because effectively it is just a setup card. You draw some cards, and that's about it. For a Counter plus Soul, that's not a lot of value, and it's an act ability, which means it's main phase. If this was an auto on attack skill, then we could have potentially something really nice on our hands, but sadly that's not the case. And even its passive ability to give 5k power is kind of underwhelming, because once again Gaia is better, because Gaia can give way more power onto the field, and Gaia himself can be an actual strong unit that swings with double critical. And on top of that, Gaia enables multi-tag with its Engorge or Retire Own Unit skill that's built in its own kit. Now, that's not the case with Gigannoblazer. It doesn't retire anything, it doesn't really put out a lot of pressure. It does give you more consistency because it allows you to draw cards and it puts gauges onto the field. But the problem is that both these skills are Vanguard Circle skills. If this card was Vanguard Circle / Vanguard Circle skills on both skills, or maybe only on its act ability, then I think it was a really good card for Tachikaze, because it will probably be the go-to support grade 3 for almost any build. But that's not the case. It's completely Vanguard Circle, which means it's a boss unit, but as a boss unit, it's not really that great. That said, because it builds some resources with the draw, and it can set up your first grade 3 turn, it could be a nice first right or backup unit for a lot of decks, and probably mainly for Gaia, because Gaia's main power comes out when your opponent is grade 3. So if you went first, you could go into this thing first, get its draw potential, build up some resources, and then next turn go into Gaia to finish off your plays. That could be the case, but as a main boss unit itself, this is really, really bad, because even then, Gaia might be even better, and Gigannoblazer is definitely 100% better. So yeah, Gigannoblazer, not so excited about it. But if we go into the new Grade 1 and Grade 2, then we get some really, really exciting stuff to look at, because they got a new Grade 1, which is Savage Shooter. And this card has the ability on a Vanguard circle, when placed, cost Soul Blast 1, draw a card, and call a card from your hand to the rearguard circle. Put the top card of your deck face down as a equip gauge for that called unit. So in this case, you're forced to put the gauge onto the unit. It's not a may or an optional thing. Now, what's interesting here is that there is no restriction on this effect, which means you can call a Grade 2 to the field on your very first turn and have a strong beater. Or you could maybe call a Grade 3 to the field if you have a really strong rearguard Grade 3. Now, I'm not too familiar with Tachikaze to know exactly which cards could be great. I know there is a Savage Grade 3 with, I believe, 27k power on the body, and it needed to have a gauge, I think, to basically stay onto the field, which works with this card because it immediately gives us the gauge. But I think the more ideal targets are cards like Sweeper Aquacanto, because you not only give it already one gauge, it creates a gauge for itself, and if you have another card that can give him gauge in the early game, which is definitely possible with all the Grade 1s in Tachikaze, you can immediately have a triple gauged Sweeper Aquacanto on your very first turn when you just ridden up to Grade 1, which means that Sweeper Aquacanto will already be 24k, that is not removable for your opponent, and they are just at Grade 1, which can be an incredibly blowout play for a potential OTK build that then builds up towards an Gigannoblazer. So I think this as a Grade 1 for an Gigannoblazer build is pretty insane, but can also just work in any other Tachikaze build because it just gives you more aggressive plays in the early game while also drawing new cards so you go faster through your deck, which increases the consistency of your plays because you draw the cards in your hand and then you superior call something instead of just superior calling the top card of your deck. But then it is even better because it has a second effect, which is act on rearguard circle, cost, rest this unit, and put a card from your drop zone as an equip gauge for one of your rearguards without any equip gauge. Thank the Lord! Tachikaze finally gets a card that equip gauges from the drop zone. I think this is the first one. I could be wrong here, but thank God that they finally get a card, because they needed a card like this, because the problem with equip gauges in general is that you're blindly equipping them from your deck, so you have no control over which units you're sacrificing for potential pluses or just generic power buildup with Super Aquacanto. And in most cases, any Tachikaze player can amend to this, is that most of your triggers will disappear into them, or your Grade 3 ride targets that you actually needed in your hand, or maybe even combo pieces, which is super annoying. Now, with this card, that is somewhat circumvented, because now at least you have some equip gauges generation that can be done from the drop zone. Now, sadly, the restriction is somewhat annoying that it can only be done on units that have no equip gauges, so it needs to be the very first one. And this could be doable, but as we've seen with a lot of these cards, even the Grade 3 and also with previous supports, that a lot of the cards that we have allows the superior call units to the field and then immediately equip a gauge to them. Now, that doesn't really synergize really well with this card. Now, luckily there are definitely cards that do not immediately give you gauges, or you just build them up slowly while you're attacking or doing other stuff. So there's definitely room for this card to actually generate equip gauges. And let's be real, even if this card generates 1 or 2 equip gauges over the course of a game, that's definitely a win, because that's at least 1 or 2 cards less that's training on your deck, because deck out can also be an issue for some equip gauge builds. But it also means that there's less chance that you accidentally put a trigger or a key piece under one of your units that you actually don't want to happen. So yeah, Savage Shooter as a Vanguard ride target is an incredibly powerful card, but as a utility option is also really, really useful. But the next card is even better, and I should say miles ahead, because this new Grade 2 is actually bonkers. Because this new Grade 2 for Tachikaze is Blackmail Dragon Spinal Extort. And let's just look in awe of that name. Not the skill, just the name. I mean, this name is brilliant. It's called Blackmail Dragon Spinal Extort. Keep doing what you're doing, whoever made up that name. But let's take a look at its skill, because its skill is even better than its name. Because its skill is auto and Vanguard the rearguard circle. When it attacks, a Vanguard costs counter +1 and retire another rearguard. We've seen this type of skill time and time again. There's a lot of Tachikaze, and actually this is a skill that we want because it enables potential multi-attack plays. And then, what it does is draw a card, so it negates the minus, and call up to one of the equip gauges from the unit retired for this cost to the rearguard circle. Put the top card of your deck face down as an equip gauge for the called unit. Oh my god, why wasn't this card in the Gaia set? Holy crap, this thing is insanely good for the Gaia deck and even for generic Tachikaze, because Gaia was all around multi-attacking with specific units that can superior call units from their gauges. And the two cards that we had were Blue Sprint and Regiment Dragon Regio Dawn. Both of them had the skill, when they were retired, you could superior call a gauge unit underneath them to a circle and then potentially give them a gauge. So if you combine it with any of the Mega Rex or with Gaia or Lesser Rex or something else that could retire, not Lesser Rex but something else, a grade 3 that allowed you to retire your own units, you could multi-attack during the battle phase. Now that was fine and all, but the problem with that playstyle is that it's super RNG reliant, because you need to draw those two specific cards, the grade 1 and the grade 2, and then you need to hope that you get good gauges on those units. Now, as you probably are aware, that grade 1 that we just talked about, Savage Shooter, which allowed us to put a gauge from the drop zone, works incredibly well with those two cards. Because now you could gauge a specific grade 2 or grade 3 in those two units for Regiment Dragon, Regio Dawn, or Blue Sprint, so you know what you're gonna multi-attack, which is already really, really good. But now, thanks to this grade 2, we no longer need to rely on those two specific cards, because our entire deck will turn in those cards. Because if this card retires one of our rearguards, we can superior call any of their gauges to a rearguard circle and then attack with them again. And we can even equip them a gauge so that then synergize with any other future plays. And interesting enough, if this card would sacrifice or target a Regiment Dragon, Regio Dawn, or a Blue Sprint, you could actually generate 2 attacks, because if those cards have 2 gauges, you not only can superior call one unit with this effect, but you then can superior call the other unit with the skill of the Regiment Dragon or the Blue Sprint itself. And not only do we have now the grade 1, the Savage Shooter, with those two specific superior calls, which really work well together, we also had the grade 2 Triple R, which I cannot come up with the name what it was called, from the Gaia set, which had the skill that if it was superior called from a gauge, then it will get an additional 10k power. The problem with that card is that it's super RNG, because it was reliant on being underneath Regiment Dragon, Regio Dawn, or Blue Sprint. Now, not only can we use Savage Shooter to put that card specifically underneath those two cards, which fixes the whole RNG situation, but now thanks to this card, we don't even have to put him specifically underneath those cards. If it's just underneath any of our units, we can multi-attack with it, because we can just target the unit where that card is gauged upon, and then we can superior call out of it thanks to Spinal Extort. So I already talked about how good Savage Shooter was, because it was super generic and do a lot of stuff. But now that we see Spinal Extort, we can also see the actual value of Savage Shooter. Not only does Savage Shooter allows us to build up our Blue Sprint and Regio Dawn's multi-attacks, but now we can actually build up any multi-attack thanks to Spinal Extort, and Spinal Extort can give any Tachikaze deck inherent multi-attack capabilities without needing to rely on a very intricate specific engine with a lot of pieces, which was the case with the Gaia support that we had last year. Now with this, Tachikaze can look really, really solid in a generic sense. And we can still put this in Gaia. Don't get me wrong, these two cards could make Gaia as a specific solid deck actually really, really good, because the multi-attack potential no longer revolves around actual RNG. You will have full control over what actually is going to happen, and now the passive power of Gaia allowing you to put extra power on every unit with a gauge suddenly becomes even more important, because now we're going to actually multi-attack with strong units with actual good skills, and that extra passive power on top of every single attack will actually matter. And if we then pair this off with a Blue Sprint or Regiment Dragon Regio Dawn, which then generate 2 attacks, then we actually start to look at a really interesting deck. And who knows, I might be overestimating everything that can happen, but with the way that we can now multi-deck so easily, this might actually be the new Gurgrid with more steps, but definitely with the same power output as Gurgrid could provide. Yes, it cannot accelerate Excel markers, but Gurgrid cannot do that as well anymore, because they lost their Bluish Flame support. So I am very curious of how this deck will perform, because I think there's actually a lot of potential thanks to this card. Because this grade 2 and that grade 1 Savage Shooter are pretty damn good, and I think people are overlooking that because of the fact that Gigannoblazer is such a lackluster card. But that card aside, Tachikaze is looking pretty damn sweet. But that's basically my thought about the cards, and that's also everything I want to discuss in this video. Granted, I am aware that we've got the new announcement of the Bushiroad Spring Fest, and that we're gonna have this whole new tournament series happening in the next coming months, but I want to wait addressing it because we don't know a lot. We just know the initial information, and there's still a lot of unknowns about potential the Zero Circuit and a potential Bushiroad Discord remote fight tournament. We don't know any details about it, and I want to wait until we get all the details to actually make a separate video on talking about the intricate parts, because I'm kind of hesitant with how it all is gonna work out, because we're still in the middle of the pandemic, and at least here in Europe, I am not so sure if we even get to have access to the shop qualifiers, those shop tournaments itself, because everything is still in lockdown here. So I'm gonna wait on that one before I'm gonna address and share the information in its totality. But with that said, let me know all your thoughts in the comment section down below, what you guys think of these new Tachikaze cards. You don't have to share about Giganoto Blazer if you think it's a disappointing card, because we all share that sentiment. But who knows, maybe you see actual potential in the card, you can definitely share it in the comment section down below. But what do you think about this new grade 1 and grade 2? And do you think there's actually some credit in the statement that this could be the new 2021 Gurgrid variant? Yes, it's not as powerful as the Gurgrid from 2020, but even Gurgrid isn't as powerful as the Gurgrid from 2020, because Gurgrid 2021 got neutered with the latest restriction on the ban list. So I'm very curious what the generic stance is on everybody for this new support for Tachikaze, because I definitely see a lot of potential in this, and I'm very curious how far they can take it. But with that said, I'm gonna give a huge shout out to my patrons over patreon.com/VanguardInsider. You guys are amazing for making everything on this channel possible. If you do want to support the channel and everything that's happening on this channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a patron today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one!